T.J. Hooker returns next week at this time. Now a special presentation.
Hi, I'm Alex Ross.
Basically, my story is one that I kind of go in places where I'd like to revisit from classic history of the FF. I'm revisiting a story that's not been really sequeled ever before. Intention with doing this project is to not just pay tribute to the work of Jack Kirby in his time on the series, but also give it a sort of physical grounding in a mixture of realism with the styling that Jack brought to his work, where I feel a strong kinship to that work being something grounded that I'd like to translate to the viewer as something that will work for everybody.
Very excited to be talking to Dr. Michael Vassallo, who has been shepherding this great run of Atlas Comics that is starting with the career of Joe Maneely for Fantagraphics. Michael, thank you very much for joining me today.
Happy to be here, John.
Let's put Atlas in perspective as far as where the company was in the 1950s. What do we know why they changed from Timely to Atlas?
The actual name Atlas was really Martin Goodman's distribution company. And at some point in the early 1950s, really about 1951, it became both a distribution logo and it also became a brand for the company. But he had used that brand of that Atlas globe on and off in the 1940s on various other periodicals, not only a couple of comic books, but True Crime Detective magazine, Crime Digest paperbacks, and it just really never stuck. And in the 1950s, it stuck for good.
Yeah, certainly for the rest of the decade until the change to Marvel.
Yeah.
They and also kind of Timely, Martin Goodwin, notorious for lots of different genres in pulp and comics. I would imagine. Did they do any other magazines that weren't storytelling, fiction?
Goodman, the comic books were only one part of Martin Goodman's publishing empire, if you want to call it, which ran under the umbrella Magazine Management. He started out in 1933, but really 1934, publishing pulp magazines. And he took that, you've heard of the Red Circle pulps. Well, those were his, Red Circle. And then, of course, he jumped on the bandwagon with Marvel Comics #1 in 1939. And in no time at all, he was branching out to true crime magazines, girly humor magazines, a copy of Hugo Gernsback's Sexology type magazines, Reader's Digest ripoff type magazines. And then about 1946, he started with the film and Hollywood magazines also. And they were a very, very large part of his publishing line into the 1950s and then into the 1960s. Television magazines, and the romance magazines. There were just so many of them. But one of the biggest sellers were the men's adventure magazines. He really sort of pioneered the market. He started out with Stag in 1949. And it started out as a magazine that the World War II veterans would read. And certainly when the Korean War started, they had all these war covers and everything. And after Stag came Male and Men in Action and Men. He just promulgated the newsstands with these types of magazines. They were probably his biggest sellers, actually. But running at the same time was the comic book line. World War II, he made a fortune with the Golden Age comic books, but following the war, for the most part, superheroes, went into the toilet, and he was right on the spot, already giving up on superheroes and branching out into humor comics. Well, they started early on humor comics, but by 1947 he was doing crime comic books, and then in 1948 and 49 came the deluge of westerns, romance, and then of course horror.
Very cool. Yeah, and I know too, going back to the 30s, Kazar was originally a pulp hero, and
Yeah,
then of course later exploited in
yeah.
the comic book.
Actually, you can't see it, but up on the shelf there is the three issues of Kazar. I can pull
Oh,
them out
that's great.
if you want to see them.
That's terrific. I remember at the Society of Illustrators in New York a few years ago, many years ago now that I
Yeah.
think about it.
It's around the
Uh,
corner from my office.
oh, that's great, man. What a great place.
Yeah,
And Blake Bell was there with Al Jaffe,
yeah,
and I know Paul Levitz was in the audience, and I saw at least one. I don't know if those were your pulp magazines.
they were.
That
I was there also.
Oh, that's great, man. Oh, I'm sorry we didn't know each other. That's
That's
terrific.
okay. I was on stage with Blake Bell, and we had Al Jaffe and we had Stan Goldberg there
Dan
also.
Goldberg, absolutely, man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a nice time.
Yeah, it really was. No, and
Yeah, yeah.
again, incredibly informative. And that's why I'm so glad you're doing this.
Well,
Truly, Mike.
that was John. That was for this book.
Yes,
This book right here that I did with Blake Bell.
absolutely. The Secret History of Marvel Comics
Yeah,
for the
yeah,
audio audience.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. No, honestly, man, I'm so glad that you and Blake did this, and I'm really
yeah,
glad you're doing the projects now for Fantagraphics.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so what was Stan Lee's role during the 50s? Martin owned the company, but what was Stan doing?
Well, Stan Lee was the if you I don't know if it was an official title, editor in chief, but he was basically the unofficial editor in chief of the entire line of comic books. There were editors who were under him. He did some writing. He didn't do a lot of writing. The old saw, and he might have even mentioned it in interviews over the years that he was before the Fantastic Four appeared. He was writing everything, that Atlas was putting out. Not so. He did some
Interesting.
write. Yeah, he did some writing, but most of the stuff there was a huge phalanx of freelance writers who wrote for the line.
And it's certainly as evidenced in this Manili collection, a lot of the different writers, and you even say when you're able to
Yeah,
figure out who wrote it,
yeah.
you attribute credit, and that was kind of difficult.
There are a lot of writers who to this day are pretty much unknown. Some of the writers kept their work records, and those work records over the years have finally come to light. And they kept meticulous records with story titles, etc. And I've had access to at least three sets of records from three separate writers, and I've been able to assign hundreds and hundreds of stories to the Atlas stories in the various genres, but it still doesn't come close to accounting for all the writers. But I will say one thing: Stan was the only one who signed the stories that he actually wrote. The only one.
Yeah, and maybe that dual role of, was he also considered the art director as well, or was there an art director?
I would say he was considered the art director. There were probably unofficial art directors. During the 1940s, in the timely years, they were in the Empire State Building, and I would say that the unofficial art director was probably Sid Shores, who was a little bit older than a lot of the younger artists that were coming in, and was a mentor to a lot of the young artists. But I would say Stan probably had the official title as art director. As a matter of fact, I think I've even seen in some of the books where there are some credits, his name would be listed as art director.
I noticed too, and you certainly mentioned, because Timely, had their superhero line, as you say, as they fell out of favor in the 40s, they stopped. They did try briefly in the early 50s to bring it back. And Manili did, like you said, I believe three Submariner covers.
Yeah, we call it the Atlas Hero Revival. There was an attempt to bring back the Submariner, Captain America, and the Human Torch, and of course they still had Carl Burgos doing the Human Torch, who created the character. They had Bill Everett, who was still doing the Submariner, and those are beautiful, beautiful stories. There's some of the best artwork of Bill Everett's career. And Manili, who was basically doing every genre there was, did get the assignment to do 3 Submariner covers. And they're kind of cool because that's really the only superhero work that he really ever did.
Unless you count the Black Knight, who kind of was retrofitted into the
True,
superhero line in the 60s and stuff.
true.
Yeah, no, it's really fun to get to know his work. You mentioned Sid Shores.
Yeah.
Were there where, like, again, these were all freelance guys working for.
No, see, in the 1940s, they worked in a bullpen on staff in the 14th floor of the Empire State Building, and they had a very large staff of adventure artists, which were superhero artists, humor artists that were churning out crazy comics and comedy comics and whatnot. But the staff was let go at the end of 1949, and everyone went freelance after that. And within a year, it was basically Atlas Comics, and everything was done on a freelance basis going
Was
forward. Yeah.
was Manili part of that staff and then worked freelance, or?
Neely shows up in 1949. So he couldn't have been on staff because he was still living in Philadelphia at the time. He was probably taking the train into New York to, make the rounds, look for work. He had started out at Street and Smith Comics, and he had done about 2 years worth of work at Street and Smith, but he did it long distance. He did it through an art service in Philadelphia, and that's where the work that he did for Street and Smith was funneled into the city. But Street and Smith shut down their comic book division at the end, was at some point in 1949, and he was working almost exclusively for Street and Smith. And he needed work, so he started to come into Manhattan, and he was making the rounds. And I guess the first stops he made was Timely Comics, and they gave him a couple of assignments. He turned them in. I'm convinced I've spotted him in stories where there are a lot of diverse hands that you could see, because a lot of the work done on staff at Timely was done in an assembly line fashion. So there were pencilers and there were inkers, and there were even different pencilers and different inkers on different pages. So it was just a real assembly line. So I'm pretty confident that I've spotted Manili pitching in, as it were, on some of those Western stories in 1949. But the first story he did solo did appear in 1949 for
Okay.
Timely.
And I'm glad you mentioned Street and Smith. I certainly read that in your introduction. Great, extensive bio of Manili at the
Thank you.
beginning of the book. Absolutely. And again, the right guy to do it. But mentioning the Street and Smith stuff, yeah, people might know, obviously, both the pulp and radio hero, The Shadow, was a big Street and Smith thing. Doc Savage as well, I believe.
Yeah. Actually, Joe never actually drew a Shadow story, but one of his backups were in one of the issues of Shadow Comics.
Okay. And also, ironically, one of the horror Atlas stories in your collection is called The Shadow, and having nothing to do with the pulp hero. Kind of a classic O. Henry sort of horror that was typical of what Marvel was putting out. I as a kid, I know I was reading Where Monsters Dwell, which reprinted a lot of the horror stuff.
Well, I could give you a little background how I got, interested in Joe Manili. Just like what you said, I didn't read comic books in the 1960s. I was born in 61, and there were no comic books in my house, throughout the 1960s. I found them on my own in the early 1970s at a local candy store. And one of the things that I liked the best of those comic book racks were all those reprints that Marvel was publishing. So, you mentioned Where Monsters Dwell. They published so many different horror reprints at that time, Vault of Evil and Uncanny Tales from the Grave and not Crypt of Terror. That's an EC title, but titles like that. And reading them, they always had on the bottom a little thing said originally published in. And to me, it was like, what are those books? Where are those books?
Yeah.
And it took a while, years later, as I got older and started getting involved with comic book conventions and back issue dealers that I finally found that those books did exist. And I made it my ambition to try to track down every single issue of every single Atlas comic book.
As you pour through both Timely and Atlas comics, because Goodman had a reputation of really seeing a trend and jumping on it, and in fact, a lot of people will see in this Manili collection
Yeah.
some of the horror books, and accidentally mentioning EC, would have a narrator the way the EC books would, the Crypt Keeper and the like, and the Witch.
It is without a doubt, based on what you're saying there, that Stan Lee was looking at what EC was doing. They had one title called Suspense, which ran about 29 issues. It was a licensed book off of the CBS radio series and then television series. The first two issues were crime comics, more close to what the radio show was. But by the third issue, it really became a horror comic. And on the bottom, it always says based on the CBS television series or radio series. And, 3/4 of the way through the run, that little blurb vanished.
Interesting.
Yeah, it did. But I forgot where I was going with this, but I lost my train of thought.
No problem, man. No, and we were just, discussing how it seemed Goodman was jumping
The reason
on
I
trends.
mentioned Suspense was because Stan Lee was looking at what EC Comics was doing in those years of 1951, 1952, and even 1953. And what Stan did really for the first time is he put a letters page in Suspense. And I mean, when you read the letters, they look like Stan wrote most of the letters. And I think he even got his wife to write one of the letters, and the addresses were Stan's house on Long Island and whatnot. And in the war books during the Korean War, when the war genre got started, they were looking at what Kurtzman was doing over at EC and trying to copy that also.
Makes sense.
So yeah, they were looking at what EC was doing, certainly.
No, and again, when people read this collection, they will see a similarity to a lot of the EC books. I absolutely was going to ask you about Suspense. I'm an old time radio fan, as well. I'm a big just 20th century pop culture fascinates me.
Yeah,
and I noticed too that not only Marvel, or I should say Atlas, but I know DC had their share of licensed radio programs. I know Mr. District Attorney was a popular radio show, and I know that was a DC book. So
with Atlas, there were a handful. There was Suspense. There was My Friend Irma. Let's see what else. Oh, Casey, Crime Photographer.
Great. Yes, also, go on. Yes.
Flash Gun Casey.
Yes.
Those three were licensed titles from CBS, and the reason why it was all CBS is that Goodman's business lawyer's brother was, I think, assistant director of publicity at CBS.
Oh,
so
wow.
they were able to grease the wheels to get the license fairly easy in that manner.
That's great. But, I'm glad you mentioned Casey, Crime Photographer, another really great radio show. Yeah. But I know within the last 10 or 15 years, they kind of retconned that 50s period Marvel when they brought the superheroes back.
Yeah.
And you likely know as well. We're almost the same age, Michael. But when they did a mini series of it wasn't Steve Rogers. Steve was in the ice, supposedly.
Oh yeah. I know what you mean. Yeah.
And I want to say Carl Kiesel wrote a Cap miniseries about the replacement Captain America, and Flash Gun Casey was one of the side characters in it.
Oh really?
That was cool. Great. Absolutely. Well, and again, being an old radio fan, I recognized right away, and I'm like, absolutely, that's Casey, Crime Photographer. That's fantastic.
Actually, the Casey, Crime Photographer comic book is pretty good too.
That's good to hear.
Well, it all had photo covers, I guess, taken from, well, not from the radio show, but was there an early TV show also, Casey, Crime Photographer?
Well, I know there was that Charles Bronson had a show called Man with a Camera that I don't believe, I think it was a different crime photographer. But, a lot of times they would do publicity photos for the radio shows.
Yeah.
And it could be, I remember the guy's name because you can't forget a name like Stotts Cotsworth was Casey. And it wouldn't surprise me if they made, publicity shots of him.
Yeah,
And again, as you explain the connection to
yeah,
CBS's publicity department,
yeah,
that makes a lot of sense.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Very cool, man. Well, I wonder, you mentioned to me off the air that while you're going to focus on the various artists of the Atlas period, that there's also going to be a separate track of books. I'll give you the opportunity
Well,
to
yeah,
describe.
the first one is out already. I don't know if you saw it. It's Adventures into Terror.
Oh, great.
Yeah, this reprints the first 8 issues of the title, and the second. Well, I don't. At some point, we'll circle around for the next 8 issues, but it might be a year before that happens. Coming out in April is a book I'm really waiting for. Not me, but the public is waiting for. I finally put together the second half of the run of the title Venus. So we're calling it Venus Volume 2. Volume 1, Marvel published maybe about 10 years ago. And they were going to do Volume 1 and Volume 2, but I guess the sales on Volume 1 were not up to par. And I guess the sales in the line itself was not up to par, and they just stopped publishing them. But the world was waiting for Venus Volume 2 because Volume 2 has 7 issues written and drawn by Bill Everett.
Oh, wow.
And there's some of the wildest comic book stories you could ever see. And over the years, people would ask me, when is Marvel going to do Venus Volume 2? And I would just shrug my shoulders and say, I don't know. But now it's done. The book is done. It'll be out in about a month and a half.
That's terrific. And where would you say, I mean, I'm not expecting a head count from you per se, but how big is the interest in these pre-Silver Age era books?
I don't know. I mean, there is a large group of collectors who love this stuff, obviously. I know Marvel's sales were not up to par on what their Silver and Bronze Age stuff was, and I'm sure that's the reason why. Also, I think
Sure.
they might have been a little more expensive to put together because a lot of the art had to be restored. See, the way we're doing it is I'm actually scanning my own books in
Wow.
high resolution.
Sure.
And then a friend of mine, Alan Harvey, and someone also with Fantagraphics also digitally is cleaning up these high resolution scans. So, and we're not recoloring them, it's the original coloring also. And the fans really like that. They
Yes.
they didn't like the garish recoloring that the Marvel Masterworks had. Personally, I didn't care. I mean, I was happy to even see those books. But
Sure.
but but a lot of people did not like them, and they were printed on very glossy bright paper, and again, I liked them, but a lot of folks did not. But the the reports back on this first book and also the Manili book is they love the way the artwork looks. People have said it's the best reproduction of vintage material that they've seen so far, and I'm happy. I'm happy to hear that because I see some of the reprint books that are done on the cheap, and while it's nice to have that material, it looks muddy.
I so agree with you, man. And I've loved what IDW has done with newspaper strips and
Yeah,
Clover Press as well. I think
yeah,
they do a good job. And no, I'm really glad that care is being taken. And mentioning colors, they were always known as 4-color books.
yeah.
I don't know how many colors were in was it only 16 originally? I don't
It's
even know.
over. It's out of my comfort zone. I don't know.
Okay. Okay. I remember talking to Neil Adams, and I think he gave Saul Harrison credit for like doubling the
Yeah,
color scheme, or
sure,
he worked with Harrison to make that happen
sure.
at DC and everything. But even no, and you mentioned, because I think of when Neil was remastering a lot of his old stuff
Yeah,
and putting new colors on it. Yeah, man, no, it kind of takes away the
yeah.
charm. I mean, just like as I'm sure your room and what you've got behind you and stuff has that wonderful decomposing comic book smell that we all love in a great vintage shop, you
This
know?
this this is the Library of Congress here, pretty much. This is the room at the end of Indiana Jones where they take the Ark. There's
No
more
question.
there's more molding pulp paper here than you can imagine, John.
That's
Pulp,
fantastic, man.
pulps, comic books, old newspapers, magazines, you name it. I'm surrounded by it.
That's excellent. Behind you in the frame next to your bookcase, is that a pulp cover? Is that a comic cover? Astonishing. The Yeah, let's see. Oh, there you go.
That's that's
Of
that
course.
image.
Oh, so that's that original image. That's
Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah,
Is it the original
yeah,
and was
yeah.
that reproduced in some way to make the cover for the Manili collection or
No, the cover was the Manili book was shot right from the actual comic book.
that's excellent, man.
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
that's great. I love this collection. It does cover so many genres.
yeah,
And that's great. And I mean, you know, his work in westerns was really cool. The fact that he was doing contemporary Korean War stories while the
yeah,
war was happening is pretty
yeah,
cool. All
yeah.
of it. And again, top to bottom, the sci-fi and the horror stuff too.
Well, we're
Um,
making the rounds on these books. What I mean by that is the first book was a horror book. The second book is Venus, which everyone is waiting for. The third book is going to be space opera. So Atlas published two science fiction Buck Rogery type series, Space Squadron and Speed Carter Spaceman, and they're 6 issues each. And I didn't know what to do because we're fitting 8 issues into these types of books, and that comes
yes.
to one is 6 issues. If you put it together, it's 12 issues. But God bless Fantagraphics, they just said, we'll do all 12 issues in one volume. So you're going to get all 12 issues of both series in one volume. That should be out in April, May, I think June.
Okay. And
Yeah.
back then, was it 64 pages for 10 cents? Was it 48 pages for 10
No,
cents?
no. The standard Atlas comic was 36 pages for 10 cents. In 1950, they some of the books expanded to 52 pages, and they're thicker. And
Yeah.
in the Venus book, we had that problem because the first issue, a volume of Venus was, I think, issues 1 through 9, and the second volume is going to be issues 10 through 19. And when you throw in the first 1 or 2 issues of double size issues, it's a lot of pages. But
Sure.
like I said, we're running them all in there, the entire thing. So it's going to be a thick book.
And then and maybe this was just a golden age thing, but those a lot of comics would have a two-page text piece. And I know
Yeah,
in fact Stanley's first writing for
yeah,
Timely
yeah,
was a two-page
yeah.
Captain America story.
Actually, every comic had a 2 page text piece. It was required for postal reasons. Uh, I guess you couldn't get a certain type of postage unless it was text. It was a magazine or something like that. So they
Right, a
included,
magazine rate for
yeah,
postage. Yes.
yeah, exactly. So they had to include them. And yes, Stanley's first thing was a text piece in Captain America number 3.
And did that continue through the 50s as well, that they would still
Yeah,
have
yeah,
really?
yeah,
Wow. Do
yeah.
you know when that stopped? Did it stop in the 60s?
It continued into the 1960s.
Wow.
So I'm trying to think, my years of reading Silver Age Marvel,
Sure.
at some point it was abandoned in the 1960s. Memory tells me. I couldn't tell you exactly when, but it did continue into the 1960s.
And Joe's career, man, and it's such a shame. And I'll let people read about Joe, and they can learn more. I want to give people, obviously, not only reading the comics, but your great work as
Yeah,
well. But there was that period, and I suppose it kind of was part of the era in which Joe was doing his Atlas books, where Martin Goodman saw that there was so much back unpublished stories, and that's kind of when all the everyone was fired.
no. So
Yeah, yeah. Clarify that for me,
yeah,
Michael.
I'll, I'll put the timeline together.
Okay.
That story, and whether it's 100% true or not, I don't know. There might have been a lot of reasons why Martin Goodman wanted to disband the staff at Tomley. There may have been tax reasons. There might have been insurance reasons. I don't know. But the story is he opened up a cabinet and saw, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of unused artwork. And he flipped his lid and said, fire everybody and start using this stuff up, etc. I don't know if the story is 100% true or not. But that's what led to the staff being fired in 1949 and everyone going freelance. Now, the other thing you might be thinking of is the Atlas implosion, which happened in 1957. That's
Okay.
a completely different matter. In 56, what he did is that he dismantled his self-distribution network, the Atlas News Company, and went on with, from the advice of, I guess, his business manager, with the American ANC, the American News Company, which is one of the largest at the time magazine uh, distribution networks. They were in all the train stations, and it probably sounded like a great idea, except that behind the scenes there was problems with that company, and within a year's time they just went belly up. And Goodman had ramped up his production to the point where by early 1957 there were 65 to 70 titles at one time, not at one time on the newsstand, but 65 to 70 titles in total that were being churned out. And all of a sudden, he had no way to get them to the newsstands. So, we call it the Atlas implosion. But what happened is that they just canceled everything. And he immediately looked for another way to get some of his books onto the newsstands. And I guess he went on, he signed on with Independent News, which was his rival, DC. And they
Yes.
must have said something like, yeah, we'll take you on, but you're not taking on 60 books. You can do 8 books a month or something like that. And that was it. And it decimated the freelancers because everybody freelanced for Martin Goodman. There were so many titles. When all of a sudden there was no more place to freelance, people left the industry in droves.
It is amazing. And
Yeah, yeah.
I
And
know,
and and to
but
get back to what you were saying is that Goodman had inventory at that time. So they stopped buying new work in, I believe it was in April of 1957, and they subsisted on inventory for about 10 months. And there was nothing new. There was no more work at Martin Goodman's comic book division. Stanley was all by himself in a cubicle putting books together with inventory for 10 months. And then
can
at
you
some
imagine?
point, and then
Yeah.
at some point, the call went out again to start buying work again. And Joe Maneely did come back. He took over Two Gun Kid. I think he got about 5 issues out, and then he died.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other what if type of a
100%, man. Because
scenario.
yeah, you would imagine, much like some of the guys that came from that late 50s period and went on to the Silver Age, and that Manili likely would have gotten some sort of superhero assignment.
Well, there's different ways of looking at it, and I don't think there's a right answer at all. The way I put it in the introduction was just musing. It's just
Sure.
opinion of mine based on what I've seen with the industry in the 1950s and whatnot. But there is a business document that's dated within a week after Joe died, where Martin Goodman was going to close down the comic book uh, division, and in no time at all, he reversed, and all of a sudden, science fiction titles, Tales of Suspense, Tales to Astonish, Strange Worlds. And Jack Kirby was interviewed once, and it might have been in The Art of Jack Kirby, and he said that he had heard that Martin Goodman was closing down his comic book division, and he raced over there, and with Stan, they sort of talked him into keeping it open. And I would say that he probably had ideas for new titles, can do all the science fiction. He had been doing that at DC. So,
Absolutely.
and he was
Yes.
doing, the science fiction newspaper strip also. So that's what he knew. Martin Goodman did not like science fiction. To me, it always seemed a little strange that he would just say, "Hey, let's put out some science fiction books." A genre that never sold for me. I can only think that it was Jack Kirby who sort of cajoled him into maybe through just the force of his will to start heading towards science fiction. Plus, you had the Twilight Zone on TV, and you had all those things, that were starting. And of
Yeah.
course, and once that happened, within a few years we had Fantastic Four, #1. But what if Joe had not died? Was Goodman going to then shut down the company? The answer is I don't know. No one will ever know. We don't know. And if he doesn't die and he just keeps doing Two Gun Kid and Goodman just keeps doing what he had been doing, there's no Marvel Age of Comics in the 1960s. Now, mind you, people will subscribe to it was Stan Lee who was, pushing the superheroes and whatever. And I'm not going to get into that, right now here at all. But to me, it was always Jack driving that company. And I think it was his impetus that launched the Marvel Age of Comics.
Well, and also in that science fiction period of the late 50s, you still had tons of movies, B movies coming out. So that's true. And yeah, I mean, good Lord, I'll make the connection, and I'm sure you would agree that the Challenges of the Unknown that Jack was doing at DC is a direct through line. Especially, I mean, look at that early Fantastic Four #1 cover and compare it to some of the Challengers covers and stuff. Yeah, and that's great. I mean, again, there was a lot of you know genres sharing and
Yeah,
ideas that were born from other comics and stuff.
yeah,
Yeah, I love discovering the Heap, the big Swamp Thing like
yeah,
character that Man Thing and Swamp Thing
the
certainly
Heat.
were based on. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So no, it is fascinating. Now also Stan kept trying to break into the comic strip business, and he and Joe had their comic strip, correct?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, at the time of Joe's death, he was working on Mrs. Lyon's Cubs, a gentle humor type
Yeah.
Cub Scout strip. And when Joe died, Al Hartley took it over, and it ran for a few more months, and then that was the end of it.
It
So
was
yeah,
cool
so
to see.
Joe
Yeah.
was doing Mrs. Lyon's Cubs, and he was doing Two Gun Kid and assorted covers all over the line.
It's cool. Yeah, no, and I'm glad you even have some strips in the Manili book as
Yeah,
well, to reflect that work.
yeah.
No, it's really, really interesting. So now you say that Jack obviously might have been the through line in terms of pushing him into sci-fi. Um, is there a lot out there as far as, and I don't know if you ever got a chance to talk to Stan about Manili.
I did. I knew Stan not well, but I had his email address for at least 15 years before he passed away, and before he stopped answering his email. And he knew my name from the Marvel Masterworks and whatever. I ran into him in San Diego a few times, but I would pick his brains, but I would pick his brains about old stuff. So he felt comfortable with me. I wasn't going to bring up any of the controversial stuff. So I would ask him about some of the earliest stuff when he broke into the business at Timely, uh, uh, what he remembered about so and so person and whatnot. And his memory about that old stuff was better than you would have thought. He did recall a lot of that stuff. Actually, he had no idea how I knew all about that stuff. He would say I knew more about Timely and Atlas than he did,
That's
which was
terrific.
probably true.
Well, again, and you were sifting through the grains of sand and
Yeah,
getting a lot of the stuff that I'm sure was just day to day
yeah,
in his brain and out of his brain. So
yeah.
no, I can appreciate that definitely. Um, of Manili's genres, it my favorite stuff he was doing, based on what I read in the book, was the westerns, obviously, and I really, really, really appreciate. Do
He
you have a
was a
favorite
really
genre that he did in particular?
are you asking me what my favorite might
Yeah,
be?
but continue your thought that you were going to say
I,
regard.
I like it all. I mean,
Okay,
he was so versatile.
yeah.
Obviously, the first thing that I was aware of him was the Black Knight when they were reprinting that, and then of course it was the horror comics in those early 1970 Marvel reprint books. And it was only after when I was already older, going to conventions and finding out what Marvel actually published before the Fantastic Four, that I realized that he had done just work in every single type of book there was. And I like the humor stuff. He was a very good cartoonist. You see that Dennis the Menace parody, that he
Yes.
did there, which was just spot on. It was really, really good. I can imagine him even going over to Mad Magazine if he had lived. Also, he could have been. He did go over, and he was in the first 5 issues of Cracked magazine. So, and then of course he did that Mad Magazine copycat that Atlas did, Snafu,
Yes.
which 2 issues of that, and I mean, whether it's you think it's that funny is another matter, but the artwork was phenomenal. The parodies were phenomenal. He was extremely versatile. He really, really was. So I guess, and I like the war stuff also. The war stuff is
Yes.
really, really good. But I think he's probably best known for the westerns because his attention to detail on the westerns. You know, you saw some of the photos I showed there. He had all these ancient guns on the wall there. He had all these uh, uh, like model sheets that that he had made up for every type of gun and saddle and button. There was so much detail, he put into all that stuff that someone who like even Jack Kirby, who I love his Western work too, he was not focusing on those details at all. But Joe was.
That's really cool. No, I also appreciate John Severin's Western stuff from
Oh
that
yeah.
era.
John
Yeah.
Severin and Joe, John and Joe were close friends.
Oh
and
wow.
and Severin was out with Joe that night, saying goodbye to him. The night that Joe died. I did not get a chance to interview and speak with John Severin, and it's something I regret to this day. He was always around. He was always, I'll get to it. I'll get to it, and
Certainly.
then it was too late.
That happened with me and Joe Kubert. Jimmy Palmiotti and Amanda Connor were very kind, introduced me to him at a show, and it was great. I knew about his St. John's work. I knew about him being friendly. Well, Norman Maurer, his
Yeah, yeah.
collaborator, marrying into Mo Howard's
Mo
family.
Howard. Yeah,
Yeah, Mo Howard's daughter
yeah,
from Mo from the Three Stooges.
yeah,
So yeah, I mean, yeah, we totally bonded over just talking about the Stooges and things
yeah,
like that. And I regret never having him on Word Balloon. It's like,
yeah,
so close. So I
yeah.
can absolutely appreciate that.
Joe and John Severin occasionally would even trade off pages of stories. You could find Western stories, by John Severin. You can say, oh, these panels, there's Joe Maneely in this panel. And you can look at some Joe Maneely Westerns and say, John Severin was doing work here too. So I think John in an interview somewhere even said that they would pass pages between them and do that.
And again, mentioning Kubert too, I felt like there's one war story that it takes place in the rain, and it felt like a Kubert kind of art choice and everything, the way that Manili drew it. No, really, again, I think this is really interesting stuff, and I'm so glad that you're doing this, and also look forward to whatever other Atlas, artists you have planned spotlights of. I think it's going to be great, and I
Well,
don't whatever you want to say as far as who might be coming up, and if you don't want to
well,
say it,
unfortunately, we're only going to get one artist edition a year.
okay,
So I mean, I have a litany of people who I want to do, and I run them by Fantagraphics, and of course they might not always agree with me. They're thinking in terms of what's a better name, a name that might sell, and I understand that, certainly. The bottom line is
sure.
they got to sell books. But we have some good people, and if as long as the books keep getting bought, I'll keep making them.
That's great, man. And forgive me because I didn't realize I don't buy because I don't have the if I had the bank, I would certainly buy a lot more omnibuses and masterworks and the like. So you did do a lot of work on those Marvel Silver Age masterworks?
I wrote the introductions to not Silver Age, the Atlas Masterworks,
Oh, I see.
the
Okay.
Atlas Masterworks, not the issues that did the Atlas Hero revival. Roy Thomas wrote those
Okay.
introductions, but all the genre stuff, I wrote all the introductions to them, and I also did all the credits for Marvel also. So that was my contribution.
I see. And again, back in the Manili book, you've got the first appearance of, and forgive me, everybody, but this is what he was called back then, the Yellow Claw. Now,
Yeah,
now just the Claw.
yeah.
But it was, kind of a Fu Manchu mastermind character.
It
Al
was,
Feldstein. Yeah,
yeah.
Al Feldstein, right?
It,
Go ahead.
it,
What were you
it
going to say about the Claw?
Well, I was going to say it was a Fu Manchu, and if you look at
Sure.
the Yellow Claw's niece, it's basically Anime Wong from the 19
Oh, yes,
30.
the great Asian actress. Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It even looks like her, and
Sure.
I think Daughter of the Dragon. I think the film was. So it's basically Daughter of the Dragon, And yes, Al Feldstein did write the first issue. Now I did speak to Al about that. I asked
Okay.
him. I said, "How did you ever get to write the first issue of Yellow Claw?" And he told me, it was at the lowest ebb of his career. He had left Gaines, and I guess he showed up at Stan's door. Stan either asked him if he had any ideas, or maybe gave him and threw ideas at him. And he scripted the first issue. And as soon as the first issue was done, he immediately went back to Helm Mad. And I asked him. I said, what was the reason that you know you went back? What happened?
Right.
Just trying to pick his brain. And he said, well, I don't know. You could ask the artist who did it. And I said, the artist died.
Yeah.
So say he wasn't even aware of anything that was going on. He didn't know anything about Joe Manili. He didn't even know Joe had died or anything like that. But it was Jack Kirby who took over the series for the last 3 issues, and of course he completely turned it around. It was no longer a Yellow Peril Cold War intrigue anymore. It became a science fiction type of a series, and it was good in its own way.
I didn't read the story yet, and I should have, because was Jimmy Woo the secret agent
Yeah,
in
yeah,
the Yellow
yeah,
Claw books? Was
yeah,
he
yeah.
in there
It
from
was an
issue one?
FBI agent.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, and certainly now, good
Now,
Lord.
now he's considered Shield agent.
Right. And I'm aware of that. Well, and it's great because Ken right? No, not Ken Long. Darn it, the Korean actor that plays him in the Marvel Cinematic movies now. But I'm so glad. I love Jimmy Woo. There was that great, as you know, because again, we're close enough in the same age, that what if issue that
Yeah,
postulated a 1950s
yeah,
Avengers.
yeah,
And then they became the Agents of Atlas, of
yeah,
course. And
yeah,
my good friend Jeff Parker wrote that
yeah.
series.
I like
And
that series.
Oh God, yeah, man. And that's why it's like, hey, that's really cool that Jimmy
Yeah,
Woo came out of this Yellow Peril
yeah,
book that, some might blanch at today, but it had
yeah,
a positive byproduct in creating Jimmy Woo.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Good stuff, man. No,
It is good.
absolutely. Yeah. And of course, the Black Knight, those Manili stories look great. The design is so great.
You
Um,
could tell he really put extra care into those stories. And the point I make, towards the end of the introduction, online for years, there's always been a debate if Joe had lived, and let's just say in some way he participated in the Marvel universe. I remember reading comments saying, well, he couldn't have, he didn't have a style to do superheroes or something like that. And I don't believe that
I agree.
at all. We only saw Manili 1.0, and he was gone. And if you compare him to his contemporaries of the time, who later in the Silver Age were very, very big stars. In the 50s, he was already considered better than all of them. So in the 1960s, he would have just upped his game just as they upped their game.
We saw a bit of a progression
No,
from
sure.
the early stories into
Yeah,
that last
yeah,
period of his 8 years of Atlas work and
yeah,
everything, or 9 years of Atlas work. Yeah. And I would imagine, no, just like Dick Ayers, who
yeah,
obviously did a ton of Westerns, but still, was doing Sergeant Fury and also other superhero stuff. I have a Dick Ayers Iron Man that I asked him to draw
yeah,
with that very brief time where Tony had the faceplate where the points came at
yeah,
the front of the
yeah,
faceplate.
yeah,
I think I saw that for the first time in Marvel superheroes cartoons, and I'm just like, I love that design.
yeah.
So yeah, that's what I got from Dick Ayers and everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just do love that 50s period, and I completely agree with you. No, there's even Captain Comet in the 50s, those early stories. Whoever was drawing that, I think there's a similarity to Manili's style.
Yeah. I don't know who was drawing it.
I don't either, but yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, I just think they would adjust. And there was enough room when you consider who that original Silver Age group of artists were at
yeah,
Marvel.
yeah,
It wasn't just Ditko and Kirby. It was Dick Ayers. It was geez, and now I'm blanking on well, certainly Everett. Everett did that first issue of Daredevil,
yeah.
you know.
And then you got Gene Colan, you got John Romita.
Absolutely. Yeah, did you talk to John Senior at all about Manili? Were they
I did.
contemporaries?
I did. He told me the same story he told a lot of people. which was a real cool story. And that is when he was a young artist and he was starting to contribute to the line. Stan basically said, "Go spend a day with Joe in his studio," and that's when I found out that Joe had a studio in Flushing, right at the end of the 7 train line off Northern Boulevard. And it makes sense because when he moved to New York, he lived in Bayside, which is also in Queens. So he didn't always work out of his house. He had a studio in Flushing. And John told the story that, he took the train, he got out, he went over to Joe's studio, and he watched Joe pencil. Actually, Joe really didn't pencil. He basically put down stick figures and then he drew in ink, which was that's how assured he was of his ink line. And he just watched Joe, barely paying attention, do 2 entire pages in ink while he was chatting it up for 2-3 hours. And he was just blown away by it, just how good he was and how fast he was also. So yeah, John Romita really liked Joe's work.
We mentioned
And
earlier.
if you compare the work, because John did a lot of work for Atlas in the 1950s, and if you look at the work, it doesn't hint at what John did in the 1960s. So right there is just proof, that Joe would have been fine in the 1960s.
Understood. Absolutely, man. I'm really glad you included the shot of Joe's studio and all the Western reference photos and things. I know too you dedicate your work in the book to Joe's youngest daughter, right?
Yeah, Nancy. Yeah.
So do they have a lot of original art and different things that Joe might have had?
A lot was lost through the years through various floods, I was told.
Sure.
There certainly was a bit of it. Yeah, but the book was a labor of love. I've been wanting to put this book together for her for a very long time, and I want to do a larger biography. I've written 2/3 of a biography, an art biography. Similar to what Blake Bell did with the Bill Everett type of a book.
Sure.
So I have that on the horizon also. I'm hoping to do that too in the future.
That's great, Michael, because truly, since the 90s, every gesture has been documented because of video and things. And it is that pre-90s, because even I would say the 80s might even have a few things that might have slipped through the cracks history-wise.
Yeah.
So it's really important that people like yourself are out there filling in the gaps. I know a lot of podcasts with the best intentions will get things wrong.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, man. People need to talk to you and the surviving artists and writers that are still out there, and they're sadly dwindling every year.
Well, to what you're saying, in the late 80s, I started to track down artists. But I purposely stayed away from the big names who went to the conventions and everything like that. And I tracked down the guys I would see in the Atlas comics as I was indexing them. I have a huge Atlas collection. I have almost everything that was ever published, but I've also indexed the contents to every single book I have into a huge database. So I discovered tons of names that I never heard before. And these people just sort of fell through the cracks. And a lot of them were still alive in the late 80s and in the 1990s. And I just would cold call them on the phone and track them down, introduce myself. Some of them were shocked to even be remembered. Some of them seemed a little suspicious of what my intentions were. And some of them were just absolutely thrilled to be remembered. And I don't know if you're familiar with Alan Bellman. I found him down in Florida. He was just a completely forgotten golden age comic book artist, and yet he's someone who drew timely superheroes during the Second World War, and he became the last man standing. And I'm just so happy how the last 15 years of his life turned out. He was just feted at conventions all around the country, and he went to every convention that he was invited to. And it's things like that that really make me happy.
I hear you, man. No, I got the chance to meet Martin Odell when he was still doing the rounds at conventions, and he had a Chicago convention or a connection because of his advertising work at Leo Burnett and creating the Pillsbury Doughboy, in addition to all the great comic book work that he did. And no, it really, it's important. I mean, do you do work with the Tomorrows guys as far as their, Roy's alter ego and
Yeah, I'm a contributor to Alter Ego. I used to write some of the obituaries when the Atlas artist would die. Matter of fact, the first large article on Joe Maneely I did for Alter Ego number 28 a long time ago, and that sort of was my putting Joe out there for the world to see for the very first time. And so yeah, I work with Roy, and occasionally with John Morrow also. Yeah,
Sure. No, John's a great guy and Roy's a great guy. And
yeah,
I'm glad that those magazines exist, the Kirby
yeah,
Collector as well.
yeah.
Great stuff. Absolutely. And again, filling in the gaps of these men and women that shouldn't be forgotten. I forget the mystery writer that Stan briefly dated that wrote a bit for Marvel or Timely. I can't think of her name now, but it was mentioned in
Oh,
his.
yeah, yeah. It'll come to me. I know who you mean. She did show up and she did do some writing. Uh,
Patricia
Stranger on
Highsmith.
the Train. Stranger on the Train.
Right, the Hitchcock thing. Isn't it Patricia Highsmith, I think?
Patricia Highsmith. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Well, and of course, Mickey Spillane had
Nikki
his moment
Spillane.
at Marvel.
Yeah,
Mario Puzo.
yeah,
I don't know if he wrote comics, but I know he wrote for the Men's Adventure
yeah. No,
stuff.
he didn't write any comics, but he wrote for the Men's Adventure. He was on staff, I believe, at Martin Goodman's Men's Adventure magazine. Matter of fact, he was writing The Godfather while he was on staff.
Yeah, and I know it was like serialized before it
Yeah,
was turned into
yeah,
the novel and
yeah,
everything, The Godfather. Yeah, it's pretty cool. No,
yeah.
I again, it is these little things that excite you and I. I mean, I'm an armchair. I would even just say student of comics history. I would never claim to be a historian per se. But I mean, you guys are doing the real hard work, man. But
It's fun.
it is fun, and I'm glad you're doing it. And truly, that's what's great about the Maneely book. And if you don't mind holding it up one more time for the video
No,
audience, from Fantagraphics, everybody, there it is. So yeah, the Atlas Artist Edition, Volume 1, Joe
yeah,
Maneely,
yeah.
and great stuff. Great. Look at that. Oh, there you go. There's Namor. Fantastic. A Maneely Namor right there, everybody. Outstanding. Well, that's why people have to watch the video and not just listen to the audio version of Word Balloon. Michael, honestly, man, this has been great. I'd love to have you back as you're releasing these books,
Yeah.
and we get in the nitty gritty of this chapter of Marvel that sometimes gets forgotten between the
Yeah.
timely years and the Marvel
Yeah.
age.
No,
So
I'd be happy to come back. I can talk about this stuff forever.
that'd be great, man. Thanks a lot for talking today,
You're
and we
very
point
welcome.
and we'll point everybody to the book by Fantagraphics. That when is the release date?
Oh, it's out already.
Oh, it's out. All right, it's
Oh,
out
it's
even
out.
right now.
It,
So
it's out about 2.5 weeks.
if your store doesn't already have it, make sure to ask them to order it for
Yeah.
you, or grab it through Amazon and the online bookstores.
Amazon, the Fantagraphics website, Barnes and Nobles, you name it.
That's great. No, thank you very much for your time today, Mike.
You're welcome, John.
Hi, I'm Alex Ross.
The biggest reason that you wind up staying committed to something that you're not happy with is your lack of vision. It's like, I have no idea what I could do to it to make it better. It's not that you just go like, nope, that's all they're getting, that's all the time I got. It's more that like, there's time to fix anything. It's more like, the limitation of your own ability to see it, to recognize how you make that improvement.